that they may also obtain the salvation that is in Jesus Christ with eternal glory. The saying is sure, if we have died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Remind them of this, and warn them before God that they are to avoid wrangling over words, which does no good but only ruins those who are listening. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved by him, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly explaining the word of truth. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
In the name of the living God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. Today's first reading from the second book of Kings has many layers of irony and how God often works in mysterious ways through something about being God and being human that we find out from unlikely people and unlikely sources. And the setting of today's reading is the story of the conflict between Aram, which is modern-day Syria, and Israel. Syria's in the news again. So this guy, this Naaman guy, is this very powerful man in Syria. He is in charge of the Syrian army, and they have just had a major victory over Israel. And there is some kind of peace and reconciliation between Israel, but this man who's very powerful, lots of medals, lots of authority, this man is very powerful. And so in the conflict, the men of Israel would have been either slaughtered or taken into slavery, and the women of Israel would have either been abused by the invading army, as what usually happens, or they would have been taken as slaves and handmaidens. And so the story is about how one of those slave women, a young woman, a girl, an Israeli girl, who is the servant to Naaman's wife, becomes the messenger of God. A very unlikely person. And in that intimate conversation between the slave and the mistress, you know, he is everything. He's got everything, but he has leprosy. And nothing can heal this leprosy. And so this little girl says, well, I know someone who can heal that. There's this prophet in Israel. Why doesn't he go there and get healing? And so it's interesting that this very powerful man then decides to go into the territory of the vanquished. And it causes a political problem for the king, because he says, well, I'm not sure if we can heal this guy. I don't want some, international event that will lead to another conflict. And he says, oh no, go and visit Elisha, the prophet. So he comes in all his glory with his chariots and his military and his entourage. And it's interesting that Elisha does not use that for a photo op. It wasn't about his promotion. Front page of the newspapers, great prophet. Instead, he stays at home and he sends his messenger and he says to this very powerful man, go and have a swim in the Jordan. And Naaman doesn't like that. He said, what, have I come all this way? I could swim in my own country. Who does he think? So he has expectations about what his healing should look like, and he's affronted. And one of his servants says, no, give it a chance. Go and have a swim. It'll make you feel better. Cool off. And he does. And he's healed. He comes out of the water, and the scripture says his flesh was like that of a young boy. And the writer is playing against, reminding us that it's this young girl who is the instrument of God's message, this foreigner who becomes the instrument of healing. And so this very powerful man has to think again about who's in charge, that the God of Israel, this God of Israel, may be more powerful than the gods of Syria. And he's healed. And the message is that God is in charge, and that God will do strange and weird things that don't make sense, and even use unlikely people to get his message across. And also, don't mess around with holy things. Part of the story that's left out is that the servant of Elisha, the healed Naaman, wants to come back with gifts and presents and lavish it, give to the capital campaign and give thanks to God for the healing. No. Elisha says, I don't want any money. I don't want any attention. But the messenger, his servant, sees this as an advantage, and he accepts the gift, lies to Elisha. And guess what? He gets the leprosy. So the very thing that is taken away and healed by messing around with holy things, that is transferred onto another. The projection of that which is diseased. It's a very powerful story. And it breaks through our kind of belief that, our God is bigger than your God, and that foreigners and unlikely strange people have no place in this story of God. And these readings today kind of turn that upside down. And the gospel reading is about Jesus is in this kind of no man's land in Samaria. Samaria is always regarded a little kind of dangerous place. The Samaritans were regarded by the Jews, they called them the dogs. And it's interesting that in the healing in this no man's land, this dangerous territory, these lepers are healed. And what's interesting is the religious and cultural context of leprosy. In Syria, leprosy is not a kind of religious flaw. It's not something that isolates you from the community. Naaman was able to rise up as to be the #1 military guy in the country. But in Israel, leprosy was a sign that you're cursed by God and that you had to be isolated from the community and that you needed a kind of health check from the local priest to say that you were clean and that you could reintegrate with the community. It's a different kind of cultural stuff. So Jesus is dealing with his own cultural, religious stuff about disease. And he heals the people. And the person that comes back is a Samaritan, is a foreigner. And he says, thank you. And Jesus says, hey, my own people don't get it, but it's this foreigner that gets it. And he said, go forth. Your faith has made you whole, has made you well. Jesus is not saying, I healed you, or God healed you. Jesus is saying, your faith has healed you. Your faith. So one of the most helpful frameworks, I was thinking about how that connects with St. Paul's. I love pulling the readings back to the present and to the moment and to us. That story. What is that story about? How are we healed by Jesus? How does our faith heal us? And one of the most important, helpful frameworks for a congregation going through a search process as we are is to have the space and the ability to step back from our normal functioning and patterns of relating and to ask deeper questions. And what is going on in the system of relating that is working, and what is going on that is not working, that is dysfunctional, that is causing us pain, that is causing us disconnect that we want to heal. And sometimes it's very hard to have the courage to look at that. And I think about our own families, right? You think of the systems in our own families that there's often stuff going on the surface, and there's lots of stuff going on below. And sometimes we don't want to deal with what's going on below. And I think of the syndrome, there's a thing called the syndrome of the sick child. Often the dysfunction of the family is projected onto one member of the family, or the alienated relative. And we project onto that person all that is kind of wrong and bad and dysfunctional. And a good therapist will help the family to kind of open up and look more deeply at what's going on. The same thing applies in congregations. We have our own family system as a community. It's kind of our own DNA that we have inherited from the generations before. And there's a very interesting book that was written by Rabbi Edwin Friedman. It's called From Generation to Generation. And he gives this family systems theory a congregational rooting. And it says about this book, it remains a relevant Bible for every church leader seeking insight into the family patterns of congregational life. So it's basically those of us who are involved in leadership in the church, this book is a must to read, especially at this time. And Friedman talks about that the go-to kind of emotion for most congregations is anxiety. That we are very anxious systems, right? I talked to our local counselor here, Ann Klinger, a couple of months ago. I said, what are people coming to you these days about? She said, it's all about anxiety. All about anxiety, right? So how do you lead? How does the pastors and the staff and the vestry lead this highly anxious system that may or may not be in touch with those deeper kind of patterns of relating and dysfunction that we are asking for healing? A friend of mine was an interim in a church in California, and people would often come to her and say, Marnie, there's a crisis. This is happening, and this is happening, and this is happening, and look at what's happening. And she said, hold on. And she was practicing a non-anxious presence. Some parents do this very well. Hold on, if the church is burning down, that's a crisis. If someone's run off with the endowment, that's a crisis. But this isn't a crisis. So let's bring it all down and let's talk about this rationally. What's going on? And it's very important that those of us in leadership in the church can do that, and we don't react to the crises, to the firestorms that come our way. And one of the examples here at St. Paul's, I've been here 5 or 6 months, and one of the things that I'm identifying is the confusion over the roles and responsibilities of the congregations, the roles and responsibilities of the vestry, and the roles and responsibility of the rector. And it's interesting because the Episcopal Church in the last 30 years, we have opened our doors to everybody. We welcome everybody. And we have people in our congregation who came from the Catholic Church tradition, who came from the nonconformist tradition. And they don't fully understand what episcopal polity, what the wisdom of our ancestors have given us, of how we relate to one another, and how we share authority, power, and decision-making. It's interesting, if you're a Catholic, you don't have to get involved in the search process, right? The Pope chooses bishops and cardinals. They appoint their clergy, and they send them to parishes. And when it's time to go, the bishop will pull them out, and they'll bring another priest in. The congregation is not involved in that decision at all. And that's a very authoritarian, top-down model. And somebody said to me this morning, when you work with the Catholic Church, it's really interesting because you say, okay, it's done. The decision is made, go do it. We're going to take this contract on. In the Episcopal Church and other churches, you have to have committees, and you have to make decisions and all that. In the nonconformist tradition, which in the Northeast, we're full of Congregationalist and evangelical churches, the congregation is very involved in many decisions. The budget, the hiring and the firing of the pastor. The congregation often votes on that. There may be a governing committee, but there's much more accountability. But there's no bishop, there's no diocese, there's nothing above in terms of checks and balances. And so if you're coming from either the Catholic or the nonconformist tradition, and you come into this Episcopal stuff, how do we relate to one another? And the people who formed the Episcopal Church also formed the Constitution of this country. So there is, right in our DNA as a church, this democratic, we have a House of Bishops, we have a House of Deputies that are elected by the diocese and by the congregations that serve the wider church. And we're part of a diocese, we're part of a much bigger church, so the bishop has still authority to give veto to the appointment of rectors. So we have to get permission. If we call a rector, the bishop has to sign off on that. And when it is the vestry discerns that it's the end of a call, the bishop also has to give his or her blessing to that. So the role the congregation's say is in the election of the vestry. That is a very, very important Episcopal tradition, to elect a vestry that is healthy and functioning, that maintains the mission of the parish, creates the budget, raises the money, and the most important thing, it calls the rector. The vestry's job is to call the rector. And you know, if you think about it, as clergy, we believe that the voice of God, we hear the voice of God through the vestry. When a vestry says, Albert, come and be our pastor, I believe that is God speaking. And I will have to talk to my spouse and my children, and we will uproot from the communities that we are in, and we give up everything because we believe this is the voice of God, and we come to be in community with you or any Episcopal church. And I say to every vestry, that is a huge responsibility we're putting on you. It's a huge responsibility. And if that's not done right, the impact of that, not only on that clergy family and their children, but the impact on that in the congregation and the community is profound. So that's a heavy charge, right? And that's how we function. And once the rector is hired, the rector then appoints the staff. The only control over the staff in terms of management or control, the vestry is not involved in the appointment of the rector's staff. If it's in the budget line item to hire an associate or to hire this person or that person, that's the rector's call, right? And it's not like the Congregational Church where we all have to vote if someone's going to be hired or let go. That's not how it works in the Episcopal Church. And we have to be very clear about those boundaries. We have to be very clear. One of the things that I've noticed about St. Paul's in the last 5-6 months is that we are not clear about that. We're not clear about that. And historically, I've looked in the files. Historically, we have not been clear about that. The hiring of John Francis, for example, the rector before Cliff Cutler, there was enormous, well-intentioned pressure on this incoming rector to keep an associate priest who was very popular, who was very engaged pastorally, and doing a lot of work in the interim period before he came, to keep that priest on staff. And unfortunately, that relationship deteriorated, so much so that that assistant priest had to leave, and about a dozen families from this congregation left, and a lot of people who would have come here didn't because St. Paul's was in turmoil. And unfortunately, John Francis's ministry was so compromised that he had to leave, and it affected his health. And the DNA of that well-intentioned kind of over-involvement in the personnel in this church really damaged us. In my first week here, I had a call from a family, one of the families that some of the family were still here, others had left, but there was a funeral, and this associate priest who had left, they wanted her to do the service. And I had to say, that's not how we do it in the Episcopal Church. That priest is welcome to participate in the service, but I'm conducting the service, and I'm going to do the homily, and they can certainly speak as members of friends and family, but I need that pastoral relationship with that family and this congregation. And there was a firestorm. The gossip went all around that I was not going to bury that woman, which was not true. And so one of the sad things is, again, our polity is when you leave the church as a priest, you leave. And this priest was very well honored to go forth and have a ministry apart from here. Cliff Cutler understands that polity. We love Cliff and Amy, right? But they're no longer here. He had to ask for permission to come back to do a wedding last week here. It was great to see him. And our friendships and our relationships will continue, but he is not your priest anymore. And so it causes enormous difficulty when former clergy continue to be in pastoral relationship with the congregation. It's not fair on the people who follow. It's just not fair, and it's dysfunctional. And also in the time that I've been here, we have had some losses of staff, some of which were already decided before I came. Father Joseph was a very accomplished, experienced priest. And again, there was pressure. Why can't Joseph be the interim? Why can't Joseph stay here as our priest? People don't know that's just not how we do it. We needed a different kind of intervention. We needed that outside voice to help us look at who we are. And those parishes that often think, well, the associate or whoever can just become the next priest, it usually doesn't work. So the wisdom of the experience of the church is helping us to figure out why this is so. There have been some other personnel decisions that have been very difficult. And again, there have been firestorms. And again, our boundaries of friendship and loyalty to people, we have to be clear whose responsibility and authority it is to do that. And any priest, any rector who comes in here will consult with ministries, will consult with the vestry, will get lots of advice on the appropriateness of skills of certain staff people. But ultimately, the hire is that of the rector. And it's interesting, we did this process when Dan came in. There were lots of people who met him, checked him out. Is he going to work? Is this going to work for us? But ultimately, it's my decision to hire him, right? So here's one of the things that we have to be aware of. Everybody's going to fall in love with Dan. He's going to do a great job here, right? And in comes the new rector, right? And everybody's going to say, you know, maybe inadvertently, Dan's a great priest. Keep him on. And that well-intentioned pressure will once again, the boundaries, not allowing that rector to develop the staff. You know, it might be that rector sees the skills and the positivity of keeping someone on, but we cannot put pressure on them. And we can't vote with our feet if that rector appoints somebody that we don't like and off we go, or we withhold our pledge, or we create whatever. And it's that kind of dysfunction that we need to be clear about, not only in this interim period, but beyond in the search. And that book is going to be very helpful to us as we understand what our responsibility is. The most important thing you can do is to talk about the kind of vision you want for this church. You have the opportunity now to do that. And through your vestry and through electing your vestry, you've chosen leadership to make that very important decision. And their very important decision is to call the best person to do this job. And then you have to trust that that rector is going to surround themselves with the best team and the best staff to do the work. And you have to support that. And the bishop signs off on that. You know, it's very interesting. You do get a sense when a call ends, when you get a sense that you've done your work and it's time to go, it is a discernment you do with the vestry. It's like negotiating your own firing. It's time to move on. And you trust that God has something else in mind, not only for you, but for this church, and that your work is done. And the bishop acts as a kind of mediator to bless that, to make sure that nobody is damaged, that this can be done in a graceful way. I'll give you an example of how this worked in a very difficult time in the history of this country when the Vietnam War was going on. And many clergy were looking at their congregants and their families coming back in body bags. And this war didn't make sense from a moral point of view. And many of them preached from their pulpits that was the case. And many clergy in the Protestant tradition lost their jobs for preaching the gospel. They were fired. One of my mentors, Bob Cornelison, was rector of St. Mary's, Laguna Beach. And all the Protestant clergy in Laguna in California lost their jobs over the Vietnam War. And he was the only one left standing because he had tenure. He had tenure as the rector. And he had this difficult job of preaching the gospel in the midst of that mayhem. And he said, you know, it was really hard. He said, I had to sit on the mercy seat. It wasn't that he wasn't criticized. He got a lot of criticism. People wanted to go. People left the church. They were furious at him. But he survived. And that's the job that we're asking people to do. We are called to preach the gospel. We are called to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And so, to connect it again to our reading, sometimes the unlikely people, the outsiders, a kid from Roxburgh and an Irishman. Sometimes it is the people who come in with fresh eyes that are the agents of God's message and healing that may be difficult to hear. Like Naaman, no, that's not the way I want to be healed. I want it this way. And how do we let that filter so that Jesus can say to St. Paul's, I haven't saved you. God isn't saving you. It is your faith that has made you whole.